This is the third part of the events discussion of week 226 to 3.1. We're going to talk about three things. One is quantum measurements, a new perspective. In essence, treat measurements independent of state. So what this presentation, I think, was attempting to do is treat the concept of measurement separate from us and Hilbert space and states, and do the mathematics accordingly and realize, I guess, that there's a quantization in measurements, that there is a certain sensitivity that is obviously consistent with Heisenberg. But quite frankly, I don't know what the purpose was, because like Len Suskind, who was present there, he kept asking, okay, if you want to treat measurement independent of us, or physical or classical situation, if you want to treat measurement the same way you treat the quantum system itself, and not have it interact with the classical world, then how do you get information from it? So this question wasn't answered. The second thing I want to talk about is Andrea Morello. I think that was a lot more interesting. Use silicon-based technology to create spin-based quantum information processing chips. I'm going to elaborate on that. I think that was really interesting. I think it's not the first time that I'm encountering a presentation at the Q-Farm seminar at Stanford where people talk about the actual ability to create high coherence times in a quantum processing unit. In this case, the additional positive is that it's ability to do that with existing semiconductor technology, so implemented into a highly efficient, highly developed semiconductor technology infrastructure, and that's pretty interesting. The third presentation, Yanchao Bi, this is a neuroscience presentation, and she talks about perception and language and how it relates to knowledge in the human brain. This is not even on podcast. It's March 3rd, 2024. This is Krim Delco. It's a Sunday. There's no update for the year. We are down 8.5%. The market's up 7%. We're underperforming by 15.5%. The first presentation I want to talk about today is Andrea Morello. Andrea is a physicist at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and he was talking about using spin electrons and nuclear spin technology for quantum processing units. The idea is, I would say, threefold. One is you have the spin technology on its own, and I think we've discussed this in other presentations, that nuclear spin and electron spin can be used for quantum processing. You can then do that in Andrea's idea. It's doable in semiconductor technology, so you can use the existing semiconductor infrastructure, which is actually really great, and you can create actually qubits, not just qubits, so you can have more than just two possible representations. So instead of having n to the power of 2, you could have n to the power of d, which is larger than 2 representations of information, which of course increases the processing power, also increases complexity, error code correction, and things along those lines. But nevertheless, it's an interesting concept, and like I said in the prelude, it's not the first time that I come across a physicist that talks about nuclear or electron and or electron spin as the basis of quantum processing. Now, what is spin, right? Unfortunately, I don't have a coherent answer here, because I don't think it's very clear. It's something that Wolfgang Pauli made up to explain the quantum exclusion principle, the Pauli exclusion principle. But you can think of it like it's a property that electrons have, and it has to do with how electrons are connected with each other or with the rest of the universe. And it has to do with it has to do with angular momentum, but it's not just the actual momentum. It is the way electrons or nuclei, but let's talk about electrons for a second, how they're connected and how they're sort of twisted around the rest of wherever they're embedded in. And when you spin, let's say if you have a 6-tooth or a 5-tooth or a 7-tooth spin, you kind of twist and untwist the mechanics of how the electrons connected with the rest of the universe, and that's what would be a half spin. And then there's a negative spin and zero spin and things like that. But fundamentally, fermions, which are electrons that have half spin, are they follow the Pauli-Exclusion principle, and bosons don't. So that's why you can create a laser, because you can put as many bosons as you want together and create a laser. So photons, for example, are bosons. So that's kind of where I stand in the terms of physics. I think what's important for this particular episode here, the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So why am I talking about potential quantum information processing units? Well, obviously, this is technology that we have to pay attention to, because it could be we could have a massive moment here where we revolutionize computation, or if not, then at least we are on track to understand a really important contribution to the development of Moore's law. We're talking computation here. We're talking the ability to exploit physics for information processing and computation, and that is at the heart of what we do here at Orange Capital Partners, because we believe that harnessing computation is the equivalent of wealth creation. That's how you create wealth, because computation allows you to iterate, and iteration is eventually what helps disruption, and disruption is growth. So this is kind of the arc where we see, that's why we're so interested in computation. Whether it's something that we can directly invest in or not, that's a secondary question. Of course, that's an important question, but that's not the only thing we care about. We do care about computation as a concept. We follow lectures about computation, about math, about that, because computation is really nothing but iteration. That's what computation is. You can just go through scenarios much faster than if you do it, let's say, the way evolution does it, or if you do it in the lab. When Jensen Huang talks about in silico design, that's what it is. What is in silico design? It's just a very targeted way of computation which helps you design, let's say, a chip or a drug or things along those lines. I thought Andrea was an interesting personality. He's also one of those rare physicists who can talk for an hour and actually sound interesting. He does lose himself a little bit in acronyms and nomenclature, which is unfortunate. I think it just permeates through all the presentations that we attend. Every scientist, no matter how regarded he or she are, will have to show their peers what they know, and that often is at the expense of understandability and things like that. But that's okay. So I thought it was interesting the way he starts the presentation. He says there are three important things in physics. One is quantum information. The other is how do we go from quantum to classical? Where does this collapse thing happen? How does that happen? What are the dynamics? And then third is also reconcile general relativity with quantum mechanics, find a new way to understand gravity, for example. And I think where the physics community today stands is that gravity, time, these things are all emergent properties of underlying quantum mechanical processes. So to summarize Andrea's presentation, again, we have an in silico or a silicon-based technology where you implant ions, in this case phosphate or other materials that hold electrons or nuclei, and you can exploit the inherent nature of the spin of these elements, manipulate it, use it for quantum information. You have high coherence times. Why you have high coherence times wasn't clear to me. I think he tried to explain it. There are reasons that have to do with the lattice that these materials are embedded in. Why there's high coherence times is not clear to me, but I think really fundamentally important, again, is the aspect that you can use existing MOSFET technology, which is the existing semiconductor infrastructure, to actually take advantage of certain spin aspects of electrons and nuclei, which can create qubits or even qubits, which allow for highly complex quantum information processing. The second presentation I want to talk about today is actually related to Andrea's presentation, and it's Carl Cave, University of New Mexico, and he talks about quantum measurements. Now, this is a pretty interesting presentation. On the one hand, I think it's very inspiring. He starts with a quote from a conversation between Heisenberg and Einstein, and the gist of the quote is that observations are theory laude. So whether we understand what we see or not depends on our theory, and therefore measuring something is part of the theoretical concept that we work with. So measurements are not independent of the world. The measurements depend on the person that measures, not in a sort of Niels Bohr type of way, but in a David Deutsch type of way, which is, well, whatever I measure is going to depend on my theory, on my knowledge. And that's, by the way, not just based on the fact that we need to understand the instruments that we use to measure stuff, but it's also we need to understand how we interpret things. This applies to investing too. If you look at a company, you might judge a company by its margin, or by its margin evolution, or sales growth, or by the number of employees. Depending on what you look at, you might come to conclusions that are right or wrong, depending on what your goals are. So you have to align your goals with what you measure, and you have to have a theory, which I think really goes back to Clayton Christensen. I think Clayton Christensen, in that sense, was really the closest to applying advanced philosophical and also scientific knowledge in physics and quantum physics with the theory of investing, because he was talking about this. You need a theory to understand what you're looking at. You can't just look at a company and look at well, how much cash do you produce, or what school did the CEO go to? I mean, those are stupid. That just means you don't have a theory. You need to have a theory. What's your theory? Let me get back to physics. As a tangent, I really want to bring this thing home. I mean, the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. It's not a guide to investing. Do your own work. Don't use our comments here by any means for investment advice, but what we try to do is really help people guide the way they think about investing, the way they think about even choosing what to work on. All of these things. You can say whatever the scientist chooses when she walks into the lab is already a big chunk of what's going to happen, right? If she wants to study the universe with a telescope, or if she wants to understand nanodynamics by implanting ions into silicon and see how information processing might work in the quantum world, those are two, that decision alone is already a big deal. It reminds me of one of my first bosses when I worked as a columnist at a newspaper, who told me, look, the choice of the subject is already half the work. The titles, there are the 25%, and then the writing is 25%. Whatever you choose to work on already defines your article, and that's, anyway, I'm sorry for the tangent. Let's get back to Carl Cave. So I thought he started really well, and the idea, we're talking about a more subtle theory of measurement. So that's the idea here. Here's the quote: "The description of the measurements is independent of quantum states, and even independent of Hilbert space. But what space if not Hilbert space?" And then he says, well, it's a whole new world. And he calls that world the Krauss operators of an instrument live in a Lie group manifold generated by the measured observers themselves. Now, I apologize. This is gibberish, in my opinion. I understand professional physicists might know what's going on here, but I thought this is where Carl Cave kind of lost me, and I was really upset, because this was not supposed to be him bragging to the Stanford faculty how complicated he can sound. This was supposed to be a seminar with the idea to teach people something, and I feel like Cave and his collaborators don't have that as a mission, and that's a little bit unfortunate. So that's why I'm a bit, I want to take his whole presentation with a grain of salt. I think there was a lot of machoism, pretension, patronizing, things like that going on. But the idea itself is worth thinking about, because it kind of ties into general ideas of quantum mechanics, which is, okay, look, what are we measuring? What does measuring even mean? And measuring means that you connect the quantum system with our world, with our physical world. And the way we connect that system depends on our theory, and that's why that's why observations are theory laden. So measurements are not independent. Measurements are, measurements require knowledge. And I guess what probably Cave is trying to say here is that the more knowledge we have, the closer we can get to the quantized minimum Heisenberg uncertainty. There is certainly a level of uncertainty that we will have whenever we measure non-commutable entities such as position and momentum. But the measurement itself requires knowledge. So this is a little bit like we need a philosophy of science to advance science, because we need to understand what we're even looking at. This is Thomas Kuhn or Feyerabend or Deutsch in its essence. It's important to understand what we're doing. We need to understand that the theory of what we're doing as scientists is important, because that's going to help science. And there is knowledge to be gained within the realm of measurement, which can help us understand nature better. If the goal of science is to understand nature and subdue it and use it for technology, well, then understanding measurement, and that is of course, has to do with understanding instruments and developing instruments, but it also has to do with just even understanding what we're even looking for. And I think what Carl Cave is trying to say is, look, maybe we should abstract for a second of what we're looking for and just look at quantum systems as independent of us measuring them, and try to hypothetically analyze what they could be. And then we can always measure, and we can measure with more precision. That's kind of the way I understand it. I think Len Susskind was a bit frustrated with the talk, because he kept asking, okay, how can I get information out of it? And I think Carl was trying to say, look, my goal here is not to get better measuring instruments. My goal is to philosophically reevaluate what does it mean, what does it even mean to measure stuff. So anyway, my conclusion here is that we need a theory of measurement, the same way we need a theory of science, the same way we need a theory of investing. We need a theory of what we're doing, which will help us understand what we're doing and also uncover the truth. The last presentation I want to talk about is Yanchao Bi, and she's a neuroscientist, and she talks about, she asks some really interesting questions. One is, okay, how do we represent knowledge when it comes to the concept, let's say, of color and words? And then she further asked the question, how does low-level representation of, let's say, a color red with the meaning of the word rose, how does that translate into maybe higher level abstraction, where we can say a red rose is similar to a blue tulip but different than a red strawberry? Like, how do we understand these things? So she's trying to understand that, and as a neuroscientist, she starts with spatial understanding. So where do things actually happen? Where do things get encoded? She asks further questions into, once you understand, let's say, which brain activity works on the level of perception, so we see red, roses, but then which brain activity works on the level of abstract knowledge, so red roses are similar to blue tulips, but not the same as red strawberries. So that, to me, that's certainly very interesting in its own merit. But of course, in the world that we live in today, with large language models and multimodal models, transformers, this of course comes to a whole new level. It reminds me of the chain of thought or literature of locality of information. So if you think about some of the Europe stuff that I thought was really interesting in terms of locality, chain of thought. So where you have the idea, why does prompting works? Why does chain of thought reasoning work in large language models? Well, we're kind of connecting locality. So let's say a certain distribution of data is in this location, and with a prompt we can move it. We can kind of give it a hint. The search space can be reduced to that location, and then the model can get better predictions. So in that sense, I think what Yanchao Bi is talking about is very relevant to modern AI research. But let me get back to neuroscience for a second. I think it's really interesting to ask these questions, right? And then this goes back to the talk, the presentation of Carl Cave, right? I mean, what are we even looking for? What are the questions we're asking? For example, what is low-level representation? What is high-level representation? Is this the right question to ask? Maybe everything is encoded in low-level, and it's and there's an emergent factor or something emergent from there, which allows us to interpret all this stuff. Or maybe there is a hierarchy of low-level, high-level representation of knowledge. Like, those are very interesting questions that we don't have answers yet. And what applies to neuroscience applies to actual artificial intelligence the same way. Like, what does multimodal learning actually mean? If we connect text and video, do we have more knowledge? Do we really understand more? Like, some of the literature says yes, we ground video, let's say, with text. We have better semantic understanding, like the robot can reduce the search space. I think if you think about the work that Yanchao Bi is doing, or the work that people, again, this applies to AI as much as neuroscience. If you think about the brain, so let's get to the neuroscience level of understanding here. The brain is a prediction machine. So what the brain does is model the world and predict whatever needs to happen. Let's say intelligence defined as navigating through the world, understanding the real world, whatever that may be, and the brain is a modeling machine for the real world. And what Yanchao Bi is trying to understand is, okay, are there any shortcuts? Do we have reduction in search space through maybe connotation, red rose, same as red strawberry on a semantic level, but not on a low level, like it's not a fruit or a flower kind of thing. Is that, what is that? And we could argue, at least I think the current knowledge would be, we have a Monte Carlo simulation every time we do something, or something along those lines, whether it's Monte Carlo or variational inference. In the end, what we're trying to do is we have input, and we're trying to match that input to some sort of distribution, like where does this belong to? The tiger is coming. Which distribution of data does this belong to? In my training set, a tiger coming to me typically means danger. I am going to attribute that to the danger bucket of my many distributions of data that are possible, and therefore I'm going to act accordingly, because I've learned that when danger is there, I need adrenaline, and I need to fight, run away, do things like that. So that's kind of I think where we stand today as a species, really, whether it's in neuroscience or AI. Now, before I end this, I just want to put a caveat out there, which is, I always remind myself, in the 19th century, people thought that the brain is run by hydraulics. And the reason they did that is because that's what we knew back then. We knew hydraulics really well. We knew mechanics. Newton was sort of coming of age, and we thought we understand the world through Newton, and then of course everything changed. And I just wonder whether today we just look at the world as everything is computation, we're just prediction machines and blah, 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 when maybe there's a much, much more subtle reality behind this that we don't know yet. And the answer to that hypothetical question is really most likely yes. We don't really know what's going on. But to our best knowledge today, we can work with this. And I think it's worth asking those questions. So again, what are the big questions that Yanchao Bi is asking? One is, where does red and rose, in other words, perception and text, semantic understanding, where does that actually get stored, and how does it get stored? At what level of subtlety, at what level of low-level understanding are we talking about? Binary code here that then somehow emerges up to a more abstract understanding. What does abstraction actually mean? What does abstraction mean? How do we understand? How do we know that a rose is not the same like a strawberry? Like, why do we even know that? And those are really subtle questions that are as prevalent in neuroscience as they are in AI. So to summarize the three presentations, one, Andrea Morello using silicon-based technology for quantum spin manipulation, electron or nuclear spin, nuclear spin. And the idea here is that we can use semiconductor technology and also use spin to create quantum states that can be manipulated, and therefore quantum processing can be done. Carl Cave asking fundamental question about what measurements, what does it mean to measure things. I think the biggest takeaway here is that we can do research, like measurement itself is subject to study, and therefore helps us understand the world better. And it's not just in terms of instruments, but also in terms of philosophically understanding what does it actually mean to measure something. And then Yanchao Bi, perception and with language and other modes of input, and how they relate, and most importantly, how we go from low level to higher level semantic understanding of the world. Thank you.